Governor Jeff Landry and 9 Louisiana legislators, one of which is a sinless state representative Mike Johnson of Pineville, toured the U.S. southern border with Texas, where some national Louisiana Guardsmen are on patrol there helping the state of Texas. And Landry attributes them not seeing anyone attempting to illegally cross the border today to the strong presence of Guardsmen there. Landry's office provided photos and video of him and the lawmakers at the border. Louisiana National Guardsmen have been rotating in and out of the location after Landry decided to send them to Eagle Pass, Texas, to assist his fellow Republican Governor Greg Abbott. Landry says the Biden administration has failed to secure the border, and it's impacting not only Texas but Louisiana. Louisiana National Guardsmen who are in Texas don't have authority to detain people illegally trying to enter the U.S. And the Biden administration plans to propose a new rule to speed up the asylum process for some migrants.